In 1784, a frontier traveler crossing the remote ridges of what is now East Tennessee stumbled onto something he could not explain. A community of people living deep in the mountains who fit no category he knew. They weren't white settlers, they weren't black, they weren't Native American, and yet they were something of all three. Dark-skinned, sometimes with startling light eyes, speaking English, farming the hollows, keeping to themselves. For more than 200 years, the question of who these people were would haunt American history. They were called the Melungeons, and their story is one of the most misunderstood in the entire country. The name itself was never a compliment. Beginning in the early 1800s, Melungeon was thrown at a cluster of about 40 families along the Tennessee-Virginia border as a slur, a word to mark them as other, as not quite white, in a society obsessed with racial lines. And that obsession was about to cost them everything. In 1834, Tennessee rewrote its constitution and stripped the vote from all free men of color. Overnight, families who had lived free for generations, owned land and served their country were reclassified and disenfranchised. Nothing about them had changed. The law had. The cost of that reclassification has a name: Vardy Collins, one of the founding figures of the Melungeon community. Collins and his kin had been counted as free people of color on early census rolls, and that label became a weapon. It was used to block them from owning property, from voting, from testifying against a white neighbor in court. Men who considered themselves free Americans found themselves fighting in courtrooms just to hold on to what they had. Some won, many didn't. So who were they really? For 2 centuries the theories ran wild: shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, lost Turkish slaves, stranded Mediterranean traders, descendants of the lost colony of Roanoke, Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition. Every explanation had one thing in common. They reached for somewhere exotic and far away, anywhere but the simplest answer sitting in the historical record. Part of why those stories spread is a genuine genetic quirk. The Melungeons are a textbook case of what scientists call a founder effect. An estimated 200,000 Americans today descend from a core of only about 15 original families who intermarried for generations in the isolation of the mountains. When a population stays that small and that closed for that long, rare traits concentrate, and specific medical conditions appear more often than they do anywhere else, which is exactly what genealogists found in Melungeon family lines. That tight web of intermarriage is real, and it left a signature you can still trace today. The romantic origin stories, though, did not survive contact with the DNA. Beginning in the early 2000s, researchers launched serious DNA projects into the Melungeon lines, and the landmark peer-reviewed study, led by Roberta Estes and published in 2012, cut through 2 centuries of speculation. The results surprised almost everyone, including many Melungeon descendants who had grown up certain they were Portuguese or Cherokee. The Y chromosome lines passed father to son traced overwhelmingly to sub-Saharan Africa. The maternal lines passed mother to daughter, traced to northern and central Europe. In plain terms, the founding Melungeon families were the children of African men and European women. There were no Portuguese markers. There was almost no Native American ancestry, just a single instance in the whole study. The exotic legends, the Turkish slaves and Mediterranean traders simply weren't there. And once you understand colonial America, the real answer makes complete sense. In the earliest decades of the Chesapeake colonies, before slavery had hardened into the rigid racial system of later centuries, the lines were blurrier than most people imagine. African men arrived as indentured servants alongside Europeans, not always as enslaved people for life. They worked together, lived together, and sometimes married. Their mixed-race children were born free, and as the racial laws tightened around them through the 1600s and 1700s, those free families did the rational thing. They moved. They pushed west and south, away from the plantations and the county courts, into the hardest, highest, most isolated country they could find, the Appalachian Mountains, where nobody would ask too many questions. To survive there, they did something remarkable that historians call ethnic shifting. Depending on which was safer in a given decade, a given county, a given census taker, Melungeon families would identify as Portuguese, as Native American, as white. Portuguese was the most useful claim of all, because in the racial logic of the era, it meant not African, and not African meant you could keep your land, your vote, and your children's future. The exotic origin stories weren't just myths, they were survival strategies, passed down until the families half believed them themselves. Then came the darkest chapter. In the early 20th century, the eugenics movement swept America, and in Virginia it found a zealot named Walter Plecker. As the state's registrar of vital statistics, Plecker set out to erase mixed-race people from the records entirely. He ordered birth certificates altered, reclassified families as colored against their will, and specifically targeted groups like the Melungeons, forbidding them from identifying as white or Native American. Families were torn apart on paper, marriages were blocked, children were relabeled. It was bureaucratic violence, and it did lasting damage to communities that had already spent a century fighting to simply exist. For a long time, that damage held. Many Melungeon descendants grew up with only fragments, a grandmother's hint, a family word for a complexion, a warning not to ask. The shifting had worked so well that the truth was nearly lost. And then the internet changed everything. As genealogy moved online and affordable DNA testing arrived in the 2000s, scattered descendants who had never met began finding each other, comparing family trees and piecing the story back together. People who took an ancestry test expecting nothing unusual and got a result they couldn't explain went searching. And the search led them into the mountains, to those 15 families, to a heritage their ancestors had spent generations hiding to survive. Here's what the Melungeon story really tells us. Their mystery was never genetic. The DNA answer is actually fairly simple. The mystery was social, built entirely out of America's need to sort every human being into a box and the lengths people had to go to when they didn't fit. The Melungeons weren't a lost tribe or a shipwrecked remnant. They were early Americans, free families of African and European descent who were pushed to the margins and survived by becoming unreadable. They are, in the end, one of the oldest and most American stories there is, and now you know it. If your own family carries an unexplained result, a whispered origin story, or a name from those Appalachian hills, share it in the comments. Every one of those threads leads back to the same hidden history.